Imagine yourself clapping inside of a room like me in this room. Now currently that clap sounds quite dry, doesn't it? Now let's swap our room for a cathedral and see what a clap would sound like in there. Now compared to before, that sounds much more spacious, right? And that's because the sound of that clap doesn't just stop right after our hands come together, but instead it bounces off the walls, the ceiling, and the floor of our imaginary cathedral, creating echoes that gradually fade away. And these echoes blend together so quickly and smoothly that you hear them as one continuous rich sound that endures after the clap. And that's what we call reverb. Now, in the context of music, you may have heard of reverb, but you may have also heard of delay, and it's important to know the difference between the two. While both add atmosphere and this type of echo to a signal, a delay effect plays back our audio signal after a pre-specified period of time, and then it repeats the playback of that signal. So with reverb, our clap would sound like this, but with a delay effect, our clap would sound like this. And as you hear in the latter example, the clap repeats itself for a short amount of time after the real clap, while in the former example, the reverb, we just hear one continuous ongoing echo of our clap, which is the reverb. Now, with that crucial difference explained, let's move on to some of the most important controls found on most reverb plugins. And for the sake of this example, I'll be using FL Studio's free Fruity Reverb 2 plugin. First and foremost, we got the dry and the wet sliders, which are used to determine how much of the dry and wet signal we're going to end up with. The dry signal is the audio signal before any reverb is being applied, while the wet signal is the fully processed reverb effect without any of the original dry sound. Now, what's great about this specific plugin is that it provides a slider for both the dry and the wet signal, but there's quite a few plugins out there, like my beloved Valhalla Vintage Verb, that only offer one dry wet or so-called mix control, and it's important to explain the difference. If we only have one control to determine the dry-wet mix of a sound, then turning up this mix control implies that we're sacrificing part of our dry signal in order to get more wet signal and therefore more reverb. But we don't always want to get less dry signal in order to get more reverb. So that's why plugins like Fruity Reverb 2 are very useful, because we can just leave the dry signal at 100% and add any percent of wet reverb signal on top of that, meaning there's no compromise involved. Like, we have optimal freedom in setting the dry and wet signals, meaning we can choose for any possible combination of the dry unprocessed signal and the wet fully processed reverb signal. Now, later in this video, I'll explain how to do this for plugins that only have one dry-wet mix control, like Vintage Verb. Okay, so the second control I want to discuss is decay, which determines the duration of the reverb. That is, how long it takes, measured in seconds, until our reverb fades away. Meaning a longer decay will result in a longer lasting reverb, while a shorter decay time will result in a tighter and shorter sounding reverb effect. Then next up is the knob used to determine when the reverb will begin to take effect after the dry signal, which is called pre-delay. And you could kind of look at this as a kind of gap between the dry and the wet signal, where a longer pre-delay means a longer or bigger gap or pause between the dry signal and the reverb signal, while a shorter pre-delay will allow for our reverb to shine through on our signal more quickly, creating a smoother sounding reverb effect. Our next control is size or room size, which is a key component to our reverb, as it mimics the size of the space the sound is in. So quite literally, a larger room size means we're emulating the echoes of a bigger space like a concert hall or a cathedral, making the sound more expansive and big, while a smaller room size feels more intimate, like the kind of echo you'd hear while singing in the bathroom, for example. Also, a good thing to consider when using this size control is that it should ideally be adjusted according to the decay time for a more realistic effect, meaning small rooms sound better with a shorter decay time, while large rooms sound better with longer decay times. Okay, so we've gone over several controls that impact the time and space aspect of our reverb, so let's now get into some controls that affect the character and tonality of our reverb, starting with the damping control, which affects the warmth of our reverb. Now imagine you're in a room with walls made of different materials on each side. On one side there's like thick curtains, while on the other side there's just hard reflective glass. Now if you shout towards the curtain, the sound becomes softer and warmer because the curtain absorbs the high frequencies, making the echo less sharp, whereas shouting towards the glass sounds much sharper and less warm. Now, as a reverb control, damping works similarly. Higher damping, indicated by a smaller value on our knob, results in a warmer, more muffled sounding reverb, while higher values sound increasingly sharp and bright because there's less damping being applied. Now, besides damping, most reverb plugins also come with some frequency filters, typically a low cut and a high cut control. And these will finally allow us to filter out the low and high frequencies of the reverb effect, respectively, meaning we can fine-tune our reverb by making it sound clearer through applying more low cut, or for example, making it sound more filtered and less bright by lowering the frequency of the high cut knob. Now, from my personal experience as a producer these last 12 years, I definitely recommend setting the low cut to at least 200, 300 Hz in order to prevent that the reverb carries any low and muddy frequencies that may result in a muddier sounding mix. But if you do have a specific reason as to why you'd like the reverb to contain low frequencies below 200-300 Hz, then of course you should just lower the value of the low cut filter. Like, there are no strict rules when it comes to making music, as long as you do whatever sounds good and as long as you have a specific reason for why you're doing a specific action, like setting the low cut knob on the reverb. Now, after this philosophical ending to our reverb controls, let's take a look at my How to Fret Again track, where there was a prominent amount of reverb used throughout the song. Now, for the main synth used in the chorus, I wanted to emulate something that sounded immersive and large to the listener, that resembled the effect of the sound being played in a concert hall. Now, if we play our synth dry, you'll notice that it sounds a bit stale and unenergetic. And to fix this, I'm applying quite a strong amount of reverb to our signal in order to add dimension and excitement to our sound. Now, to get that immersive and large sound, I set the room size quite high, and I made sure the decay time is set moderately high as well, to a tail of 3 seconds. I'm then setting the pre-delay to 20 milliseconds, which creates a little bit of a gap, which is just enough to retain some of our dry signal at the very start, which helps dramatize the effect of our reverb. I've then set the high cut to 7000 Hz to make sure our reverb does not contain any of these very high, piercing and sharp frequencies, and I've set the low cut to 300 Hz, meaning any reverb signal below that frequency will be eliminated. And finally, I've set the wet amount to 45%, which is a relatively high value, but this really drives the effect, as we can definitely tell when we lower the wet slider. So let's compare our sound before and after reverb, both in solo and in context of the chorus. Now, an alternative and slightly more advanced way to incorporate reverb into your tracks is by using a sand channel. And with this approach, you're basically duplicating your dry signal to a new mixer track on which you insert a reverb that is 100% wet without any dry signal, meaning we're basically creating a separate mixer track solely dedicated to the reverb signal, and we're adding that on top of our dry signal, which has a couple of advantages. As mentioned before, some reverb plugins like Valhalla Vintage Verb only come with one dry wet or so-called mix control. So when we add a plugin like that directly to a sound's mixer channel and increase the mix knob to get more reverb, we're basically sacrificing part of our dry signal. Like there's always a trade-off between dry and wet, like a compromise. So if we don't want that, then we'll have to create a send channel, and here's how to do that. First, we're going to sidechain our sound to a new empty track, which we'll call Reverb Send. Second, let's load up an instance of Fruity Send at the bottom of our sound's mixer channel, which will send to our Reverb Send channel. And if we play the sound now, we'll see that both the original lead and the Reverb Send mixer tracks are playing the signal of our original lead sound. So what we'll do now is we're going to add a reverb to our send channel. And on this reverb, we're always going to make sure that the dry signal is set to 0 and that the wet signal is set to 100. Like we always want this channel to consist of 100% wet reverb signal. So if you're using a plugin like Vintage Verb, then you want to make sure your dry wet mix is set to 100% on the send channel. So now, just like with any other reverb, you'd set the controls according to what you want your reverb to sound like. But the beauty is we haven't sacrificed any of our sound's dry signal because we're basically adding the reverb signal on top of it instead of facing a trade-off between dry and wet signals. And if you want to control the level of the reverb's wet signal now, then you can just tweak the send volume knob inside Fruity Send to your own preference, or you just tweak the volume slider of the mixer track. Okay, awesome, but there's another great advantage to this approach, which is control. Because we now have an entire mixer track dedicated to just our reverb signal, we can also shape it exactly how we want it. We can basically treat it like any other mixer track and just add effect plugins if we want to. For example, if we want to sidechain the reverb signal, then we can just add an instance of Kickstart below our reverb plugin on the send channel. But we can certainly go crazier than that. We could, for example, add some saturation to our reverb signal in order to add some body and presence. Oops, that's a little too much. Or we could add a pitch shifter right before our reverb to make sure it plays in a different octave than the dry signal. Like, the possibilities are endless really, and all of this is possible because of the send channels approach, which provides us with maximum control over our reverb, as well as the way we want it to blend with the dry signal. And as we're talking about blending dry and wet signals, another cool thing you can do is automate the level of the reverb send channel, which is an old trick commonly used in the EDM scene to create more movement and energy within drops. So let's see how that would work. Let's first create an automation clip by right-clicking the volume slider of the send channel. Let's then copy the value of the slider to make our lives a little easier later on. And let's turn the automation down to 0. And now we're just going to add some automation points in the pockets of the lead melody, because in this specific scenario, it could be cool to dynamically enable and disable the reverb when the lead is not playing and when it is playing respectively. So let's keep adding and tweaking these points. And for the maximum values, let's just paste the value we initially copied because that was a reverb level that felt quite good. And after a bit more tweaking and experimenting through listening and adapting, we kind of get this cool bouncy reverb effect that adds quite a bit of excitement and movement to our drop, especially if we compare it to the version of our drop that didn't have the automation clip, which I'll play you first. Now, as you can tell, by adding this automation clip, we just made our drop a lot more interesting and dynamic. And this is a trick you could apply to any sound in any section of your song that could benefit from some more excitement or movement. Now, finally, we can also use Reverb as a transition tool, which can, for example, be great for creating a unique bridge between two sections or for introducing a specific sound instead of using a traditional sweep that can be found in any sample pack. So here's how we do that. First, we want to find an instrument we like, for example, our fret again lead. We'll then apply some reverb to the instrument's mixer channel with a decay time of the duration you want the transition to have. In this case, I'll go for 5 seconds. And then we make sure that we disable effects like sidechaining on the mixer track because we don't want the transition to incorporate those effects. And then let's export the lead with this instance of reverb on it. But first, let's make sure that we only export the first or the most prominent note of our lead, which is going to be this G5 in our case, because the actual first note, this A#4, only plays a supporting role in the arpeggiating melody. So let's add a second instance of our lead melody pattern and crop or cut it so that it only contains the note of interest, in this case our G5, which we want to export for a long enough duration to make sure that the entire reverb tail is exported, for which I'll right-click over here and drag it to about 3 bars in length. And let's then consolidate this time selection, select Enable Insert Effects, but don't enable Master Effects, and hit Export. Now let's open the audio sample we just created and hit the Reverse button. And as you can tell by the shape of our waveform, we just reversed our sound, which turned it into a cool little sweep. So let's position this where we want it to play within our arrangement. In this case, that'll be right before the drop in order to introduce the lead. And let's also cut off this final bit, which is the actual dry signal of our lead. And let's see what that sounds like. So there we go. Using Reverb, we just created our own custom sweep, helping our lead fade in, similar to the effect of a sweep, but highly custom to the sound we're using, which can be applied to any sound. And that marks the end of today's Reverb guide. While I've used the free Fruity Reverb 2 plugin throughout the video, you can achieve similar results using other Reverb plugins. Some of the ones I tend to use a lot myself are the Lexicon 224 by UAD, the Free Fruity Convolver, as well as Valhalla Vintage Verb. And because I'm such a fan of the latter, I'm giving away a free copy of Vintage Verb to the person who post the best suggestion for a future video or tutorial in the comments below. Now, with that said, I'd like to thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to become part of our community of musicians and music lovers, and I can't wait to see you next time.